name is Richard Belfield. I'm a documentary maker. I've made documentaries for and films for every British broadcaster, as well as National Geographic, Discovery, Smithsonian, PBS and Al Jazeera. I also write books. I've worked as a journalist for the Sunday Times and others. And then I have lots of other business interests as well. I help people start businesses, and currently I co-own 2 cafes and an ice cream business. And I have some business interests in the Middle East. So it's a wide portfolio. But the thing is, there was never a plan. When my mum was very old and she was in her 90s, I used to go and see her, and we sat down and worked out what the most important lesson in life was. And we agreed that the most important lesson in life is always take the interesting option. Don't take the safe one. Safe one might make you money, but actually if you take the interesting option, you'll have a much more diverse life. So that's what I've always done. I've always just chased whatever looks most interesting at the time. So as well as doing the other things, I've also written a libretto for an opera which was performed, wrote the script for a pantomime. I've made short feature film, I've made pop videos, adverts. It's just kind of whatever comes along. And currently I'm doing something I've never done before, which is, I was talking to a friend about 18 months ago, and he said, we're doing this huge documentary and at the heart of it is an investigation. Will you come and talk to us about it? You need to sign an NDA. So I sign the NDA. They tell me what the investigation is. They say, how would you do it? And I said, well, I do this, this and the other. And they said, well, as part of this huge documentary, do you want to do the investigation but film yourself as you do it? So I've been doing that, and that's now developed from being a single documentary to a 4-part series. But I can't say any more than that. I grew up in West Africa. I went to a wonderful school in Ghana, which was set up in the 1920s. The purpose of this school was for black and white children to be educated together. The school logo is a piano, and that school's now been going for over 100 years. And I think I was truly blessed to be brought up in that environment, because this was a black country. I was a white boy, although a lot of white children at the school, and it gave me a completely different view on race. And I think one of the great gifts that gave me was that I absolutely celebrate every race, every culture. Wherever I go in the world, I always find whatever is the best and most interesting thing that people are doing. So that things like Brexit, I just can't understand why you wouldn't embrace other cultures. I don't understand why you would hate other cultures. It's not. I mean, I think I always try and be sort of empathetic and be able to understand most things. I just don't get it. I can't understand it, because you're missing out on so much. So having an African childhood was wonderful, because if I go to Kew Gardens and I smell a bougainvillea, I'm an 8-year-old boy again. I'm just a child in short trousers. So that was a real, and then I came back to England, went to school, went to university. After university, I thought I was going to become a teacher. And I remember going to the door of the teacher training college, got to the front door and thought, no, this isn't me. And I just walked away. Didn't have a job, worked in cafes, washed pots, and there was a local newspaper, a small community newspaper in Manchester, which a group of us started. I started writing for that. Then I started selling stories to local newspapers and to Granada. And then I got a job on Granada television, local television news. And initially we had 1-day contracts, and then that became 1-week contracts, which was really exciting. And then that developed into a 6-month contract. And so I worked, and that was fantastic, because I worked with a brilliant news producer. He was easily the most gifted producer I've ever worked with in television. And everything I learnt from him. He was just brilliant, very creative, beautiful writer, very funny, and always came at every story from a different angle. So we did really interesting things. And I mean, it was an amazing time because Tony Wilson, who started Factory Records, was one of the reporters. We started on the same day. And from there, then I went to work for World in Action, which was the ITV's big showcase investigative series. And then at the time, the industry was very unionised, and you could only become a producer-director with a union ticket, and you could only get a union ticket if you had a contract. And I had a very good story, and I took it to the BBC, and they took me on to direct it. And the film went out, it got 6.5 million viewers, caused a spectacular row within the BBC. And then from there, I then went and worked for Central, WGBH in Boston, PBS. And in fact, I'm now doing a project with the man I very first worked with back in the 80s. So, and then when Channel 4 started going, set up a production company. We made lots of investigative stuff for Channel 4 and ITV and the BBC, and it's just sort of always been there. When I was at World in Action, a group of people had a theatre in Yorkshire, and they said, "Oh, we want to do this opera about Robert McNamara, the head of I think it was head of the World Bank at the time." And they said, "Look, you understand this stuff, will you do the libretto?" So I wrote the libretto for that, and there was quite a lot of jokes in it as well. And so I was in the middle of, I can't remember, I was doing some deep investigation for World in Action, and they just came and said, "Look, we're putting a panto on in 2 weeks' time, but we haven't got a script. The guy who's supposed to do the script hasn't delivered it." I think we had 10 days together. They said, "Will you come over, write it, rehearse it, and put it on?" So I took 2 weeks off, and I went and wrote a pantomime, which was incredibly rude pantomime. And we sold out. I mean, once people realised that this was just, 2 hours of filth, we sold out. So I did that, and then a few years later, I met a man who was an agent, and he said, "Look, there's a contract to write a book about Rupert Murdoch. And so would you fancy doing that?" So my business partner and I then wrote 2 books about Rupert Murdoch. And then in 2005, I've always been fascinated by assassination, because there's kind of what governments say policy is, and then assassination is closer to what the reality is. I've always really fancied doing that. So I wrote a proposal, went to see an agent, and she said, "Look, this is too big for me. You need to go and see Robert Kirby at United Agents." And I went to see him, and he sold it. We got a very good advance, so I did that. And then after that, I did a book about cryptography, unsolved codes, which I ended up going to America and talking to the National Security Agency to have a biennial conference on codes. So I talked to them, and then because I'd done some work with the SAS on different programs, and they said there was this big battle called the Battle of Mirbat in 1972. We're having there's a memorial being put up. Would you come and film it for us, and we'll just make a video and distribute it to the guys. So I went along, and I think at that time there were 5 or 6 survivors, and I interviewed them, and all of them will talk to me, apart from one who said, "No, you wouldn't talk to me." And then 3 weeks later, I was having dinner with my agent, and he said, "Oh, what do you know about the Battle of Mirbat?" And I said, "Well, I've just filmed the memorial service." He said, "Oh, well, one of the SAS guys has come to see me and wants to do the book." And I said, "I know which one it'll be. It'll be the one." So I met him and said, "Look, I'll do the book with you, but if we find stuff that's damaging or embarrassing to the SAS, it goes in the book. We're not, this is the first proper draft of history. We have to get it right." And he was great. He said, "Yeah, that's fine." I have been close to the Intelligence Corps, and it was an Intelligence Corps war. Went to see them. I got a lot of stuff through them. Found other people who had not. So although all at that time everybody believed it was an SAS battle, actually it was run by a young 23-year-old captain. And I found him and met him, and then I met all the pilots. We interviewed everybody, and the books then became a bestseller. And it was really good working with him, because very early on, he told me the story that when the battle finished, because they're all trained medics and they were just treating the wounded, and there were three of the insurgents there, and he said to them, have you eaten? And they said, no, we were expecting to win. Our plan was to eat your breakfast, not to be sitting here. So he gave them a mug of tea each and a piece of cheese. And as he put the cheese into this man's hand, the man took his hand and said to him in very good English, did you lose anybody today? And Roger said, yes, I lost one, maybe two very good friends. What about you? And the man said, yes, I lost a brother and a cousin. And Roger said, at that point, the man started crying. He said, and then I started crying. And the two of us sat there holding hands, crying, which is not the normal image you have of the SAS. And I said to him, look, that's an extraordinary story. That has to go in the book. And he said, I'm not ashamed. He said, we were warriors. 10 minutes before we've been trying to kill each other, but once it's over, we're warriors, and it's about mutual respect. So the fact that we'd both lost people, the fact that we were sitting there holding hands, the fact that we were both crying was acceptable. And when I've talked to the other guys in the regiment, they all go, yeah, we've all been there. We've all had that emotional rush. So what I think I've always tried to do is, in all the things I've written about, is not just to take the surface, but go beneath. So the thing I'm going to do next, I'm doing it at the moment, is I've done a couple of podcasts with people I know, and the idea is to do the undercurrents, the adjuncts to history that we to events that we know about. So one of them is a friend of mine who was offered $1 million to kill Pablo Escobar and almost succeeded. And another is a friend of mine, was when they pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein, he stole the arse. So he has Saddam Hussein's bronze buttocks, which he wanted to sell as a piece of art and give the money to combat stress charities. But he got arrested by the police, and it's we've done it as a very funny story, and it's called "Bring Me the Arse of Saddam Hussein." So with the podcast, I'm going to do what I'm looking for is the undercurrents. So we all saw that. It's one of the most iconic moments. The statue of Saddam Hussein coming down. The fact that actually in the middle of all that, there's a British former SAS soldier who was at Goose Green, highly brilliant, one of the best soldiers of his generation. And they pull the statue down, and they're breaking it up. And this Marine says, what do you want? He says, I'll have his arse, mate. And the American goes, what? He goes, his ass. Oh, yeah. So they cut his buttocks off, and he walks away with it. I don't believe in self-censorship. Lots of journalists and filmmakers do. I think it's the worst crime you can commit. And instantly, I'm just doing a new project, which is to do a graphic novel. And I met the artist yesterday, and they said, look, some of the detail here is pretty gruesome. Are there any limits? And I just said to them, no. We portray it as it was. I don't think I know that there have been planned attempts on my life, but it never came to anything. I went to Ireland during the Troubles, but I never felt frightened. Actually, the only time I really felt frightened was being in Pakistan, because if you're 6'2" and white, you sort of stand out. And Pakistan's very edgy, and particularly when we were up in the mountains in sort of Al-Qaeda country, I did feel nervous then. But otherwise, I think I'm more likely to get run over by an old lady in a scooter than, it's going to be some really embarrassing thing like that. It's not going to be, And no, so I think that, one of the things they say to women walking alone at night is, if you are defensive, but if you walk positively and you exude an air that you're going to be fine, you're more likely to be so. So wherever I've gone, also I think because I was filming recently in a very black area of America. I've done this a few times when I've probably been only one or two white people there. And the white American crews I work with are often a bit nervous, but actually I always just go and say, hello, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing. And the one thing, I'm doing some work with the media students at the moment in Kent, and the one thing I say to them is the 5 words will get you further than anything, which is please, thank you, and well done. And wherever you go in the world, if you are polite and you are open in your body language, and you go to people, it's the same when I was filming in Belfast, just to say, look, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, this is who I'm filming for, and even in terrorist areas, or whatever you want to call them, even in paramilitary areas, people would be quite open and go, that's fine. Because you've been open with us, then people open up to you. And one of the things I think you learn as a documentary maker is when you knock on someone's door for the first time, they're going to decide in a microsecond whether they're going to slam the door in your face or not. Wherever I've gone in the world, I think politeness is the most important thing. I think if you're polite, I've done projects in countries and worked with people from other nationalities who've behaved badly or who've been covertly racist. And so if you're in Egypt, they pick up on it straight away. I think if you go in with an open and a good heart, wherever you go in the world, and you're polite, I can't stress how important it is. Just be polite. Have very defensive body language. I remember years ago filming with the police in Detroit, and they had done a survey on police officers getting shot, and the conclusion was, in most cases, it was their fault. They'd gone into an inflamed situation, and they'd raised the temperature, and then somebody, pulls out a gun and starts shooting. Whereas actually, what they were teaching them was when you go in, de-escalate everything, calm everything down, speak in a soft voice, be polite, just say it, please, and so I've always just worked on that basis. And it's what I'm just saying to the students is, because one of the things you learn when you're on local programs is how to relate to people. You knock on someone's door, and it may be, that their child's just been killed in a car crash, and you're trying to get pictures of the child, which is pretty gruesome. People often don't want to talk, or they're in a very heightened emotional state, and you have to establish that rapport. I've interviewed paedophiles and Nazi war criminals and murderers and psychopaths and assassins, and I think the thing you have to do is leave your judgment at the door. Well, I always think there's something more. Most newspaper and magazine reporting and news reporting is really shallow. One of the things when I first started, I worked in the northwest of England, and Coronation Street was our big series. And our news producer suddenly said to one of the reporters, go and find a street called Coronation Street and just go and talk to everybody. There'll be a story there. And one of the things I learned from that is, and if you sit to someone in a pub, you meet someone for a stranger and you start talking to them, it's like what you do. You discover that actually there's always a lot more below the surface. And in general, because we live in a very, there are now more press officers than there are journalists. We live in a very controlled news media environment. And I think what people want, because most people instinctively believe that actually the PR is probably not the truth. In general, if the whole of Fleet Street takes a view on something, it's generally wrong. Most people suspect that. So I think once you go below the surface, then actually that's what people want to hear. Everybody has an interesting story to tell, and it's often just finding that. But also, I remember years ago, I was working on a story, and I met a former Nazi war criminal, a man, and I'd seen the footage. He'd killed probably 30,000 people, and he'd gone to America. He was a scientist. He'd gone to America after the war. They had a thing called Project Paperclip, and they scooped up all these Nazi scientists and took them to the States. And that's big. These guys built the moon rocket, and they were behind aerospace science, and they did lots of other things. And he was one of them. And they wanted to take him to Nuremberg and try him and hang him. And the American Navy went, no, he knows some pretty cool stuff. So they scooped him out, and then I tracked him down to North Carolina, and went and knocked on his door. And I was talking about it with my son. He said, oh God, you should just have punched him. And I said, no, I wanted to understand. And he was very very sophisticated, urbane, smart person. And I just sat with him in his garden for 3 hours and talked to him about what he'd done, what sort of person he was when he'd done that, because he just said that the world that he'd been brought up in, he genuinely didn't see the people that he killed, he didn't see them as humans. They were just laboratory rats. And his whole thinking was, okay, so 1,000 people might die, but if the whole crew of a U-boat survives, they're worth more. So, and it was really interesting talking to him about that had been his worldview. And then he changed. He said, look, I could never do that again now, but that's the person I was. And it was very emotional. And I thought, well, actually, it was more important to understand that mindset, because now I understand, having spoken to him, because he was, a hardline Nazi, and having spent an afternoon with him, I now understand much more. I see documentaries about the rise of Nazism. I can understand it much better because of that contact. So I think it's always about trying to understand. And then, so at the moment I'm writing a long thriller, and it's a lot of the things that have gone on go into that. So I spend a lot of time in the last few years with, I suppose, people in the sort of hinterland world of special forces, intelligence, people who were in the intelligence world but then go into private practice. And that's a really interesting world, because those people they are all managers of different realities. I mean, once the story's out there, then you think, well, that's... So, I mean, years ago I did a thing about the abuse of the elderly by their relatives, which actually resulted in a change of the law. And that was really good, because actually there was a positive outcome. But then, other things like, I remember when I was just a young researcher, I discovered that Cyril Smith, the 30-stone Liberal MP, was a paedophile, and I couldn't get my editor to do it. So I then worked with the people at Rochdale Alternative Paper, and we did the story there. I think there are some stories you just can't get out, but you keep trying. The story I did a little while ago of the attack on the USS Liberty, which was in 1967. There was a American spy ship in the Eastern Mediterranean, and in broad daylight the Israelis attacked it, killed 36 Americans, injured about 160 more. I was told that story in Washington in 1982 by an American intelligence officer, and he said, you've got to promise me you're going to make this story. And I said, yeah, I'll promise you. Anyway, so that's 1982. 2014, and nobody would buy it. And then in 2014, I got the audio tape the conversation between the pilots and the control tower. And then it got commissioned straight away. And it was great, because I rang him up. He was still alive. He was 96, and said, do you remember that promise I made to you 40 odd years ago? And he said, yeah. I said, well, I'm finally keeping my promise to you. And that was good, because that film's now been watched, I think, by it's got 2 million views on YouTube. It's probably got another 20 million views streaming. And that's good, because it helps people understand the world we live in. I read a lot. I don't watch much television. It's understanding and also solving puzzles. I have a friend who's a cold case murder detective, and we've talked a lot about this. And for him, it's finding out what actually happened. And often the investigation I'm working on at the moment, I still don't know the answer to. And it's like doing a crossword. If you do a really good crossword, a really hard one, you have an amazing sense of triumph at the end. People like solving riddles, people like puzzles, and so actually finding out what really happened is always the buzz. And also, all the time you just meet interesting people who have interesting stories to tell. So you might meet someone and that they have got a story. Maybe first 2 or 3 times they're not going to talk to you. When I first started, I was doing quite a lot of stuff in this local newspaper, a lot of stuff about the town hall, and there was a guy who was a very powerful local civil servant, And I would bump into him occasionally, and he would always say, "Who are your sources?" And I'd say, "Look, I can't tell you." And he said, "Look, if you tell me who your sources are, I'll give you some amazing stuff." And I went, "No, I just can't do it. I can't do it. You just can't ever break that trust." And then one day he rang me up and he said, "Come and see me." So I walked into his office and said, "Look, there's no point in shouting at me because I'm not going to tell you who gives me the stuff." He said, "No, it's not." He said, "I've got something for you." And he gave me a brown paper envelope full of some extremely classified documents. And I said, "Why are you giving those to me?" He said, "Well, you wouldn't give anybody else up, so I know you're not going to give me up. I know I'm safe. There you go, have that on me." And it was a fantastic story about, it was a completely corrupt land deal up in Manchester. And we did a big piece about it. And it was a big object lesson to me, which is that if you treat, integrity is absolutely, you just can't, it's not something to be negotiated. You either have it or you don't, and it's 100% or nothing. You can't ever break. And it is really interesting just meeting interesting and different people, because you get something, you learn something from everybody you meet, and you make great friends along the way. I think I have the most interesting collection of friends of anybody I know. So I have the most wonderful friend in Egypt who is a Sufi, and he has a stall in the souk in Kas you can think of, and it's just full of every kind of herb and spice you can think of. And when I go there, and he says, "Oh, what do you want? And what do you want to buy?" And I go, "Well, I want to get some t-shirts for my kids or whatever." And we go around the market, and he holds my hand, and he's about a foot and a half shorter than me, and he's very Egyptian, look, "Charge me." And he says, "There's my brother, you charge him what you would charge me." And then then there's a negotiation, and then I come away and we have tea, and whenever I see him, he always throws his arms around me, and he has a bit of English, but it doesn't matter. There's a real affection there, and that's lovely. A few years ago, I was living with somebody in Richmond. We went out for the night. She was running an IT company and hating it. We had an ice cream in Soho, and she said, "Look, I've always wanted to run a cafe." So I said, "Well, let's do it." And at the time I was making a film about the assassination of Yasser Arafat, but I did the business plan, and we found a premises. We opened a cafe. The cafe's still going. It's the absolute heart of that community. And we started making ice cream, and then her son was at university, and he took over the ice cream making. He's truly gifted. He's probably one of the best ice cream makers on the planet. And so we started making ice cream. And so we now have 2 cafes, we manage a sports hall, and we make ice cream. And it was cool because all I did was just do the business plan, and then I just do the difficult negotiations with the revenue or the bank or whatever, and then the brilliant women who run the cafe do that. That's their gift, and it's wonderful to see. They have created a community, and it's brilliant. Those people are all interesting in different ways. I mean, one of the things that always fascinated me was in the cafe we had various people come in with MBAs, and they would all tell us how to run the business. If we'd followed the advice of any of them, we'd be out of business now. Thankfully, MBA, more bad advice. We always ignored everything they said to us, which is just as well. It's a brilliant business, and I really admire them. They're fantastic. They probably know 300-400 people. They know them by first name. If you walk in and you always have a mint tea. If you've been in twice, then the third time they'll go, "Oh, hi Natalie," and they'll be already making your mint tea, and people love that. And it's just been fantastic. It's been wonderful to watch and see how a community could be created, because there wasn't one there before. And we've had births, marriages, deaths. It's been a really wonderful thing to see. So the best thing I think that's happened in the last year is I've started I've been going to college to learn to make pottery, and it's just wonderful. So I've converted one of my sheds into a pottery studio, and making pottery is
just wonderful, because I can't draw, never been able to draw. I can make films, I can photograph, and I can do all of that. Can't draw, but so making pottery is just wonderful, because you have physically, you're producing stuff. So I've got lots of Christmas presents for my kids, jugs and bowls and all sorts of things. And there's something really wonderful about physically doing things. And then at the moment I'm working on a new way, I think, of combining graphic novel art and documentary to make a different sort of film. And I'm really, really excited about this, because I'm working with two women who are students, and I think it's really exciting, this idea of actually creating a new way of looking at things by combining two things which I really love: graphic novels and film. And there is a really interesting way you can merge the two. So I think if that comes off, I will be so excited, because it's just a new way of looking at the world. And I think that's always the thing. I mean, I've always collected paintings. The first money I ever earned in the world I spent on a painting. I've still got it. The guy's now a big painter. I mean, he's a paintings gopher. I mean, I bought it, he was a student, and I was drinking at the time. I was very drunk. I bought the painting with my first paycheck. Went home to see the person I was living with, and said, "Oh, we haven't got the money to pay the rent because I've just bought painting." But I don't regret it, because we're still friends. He had a big exhibition a couple of years ago, just before lockdown, and his painting's going for many thousands of pounds now, and he could easily catapult into a very big, six-figure bracket, because he's such good. It was really nice, because I just saw this painting and he was just a student, and I went to see him 3 years ago. I went up to see him in his house, and it was just fantastic, because it was as if there'd been no passage of time between us, because I bought his very first painting, and we're still friends. And it's really nice having that connection with people. It's really important in life.